Welcome, I'm Dr. Tony Nettleman, and today I'd like to share a story about a boundary line agreement. Now, I've had a lot of boundary line agreements in the past month, and it's really kind of weird. I've had 2 boundary line agreements in 2 weeks, which is very unusual because most people prefer to litigate as opposed to make an agreement. But I've come across some reasonable people, and they want to make a deal. And boundary line agreements are great tools because they save you the cost of litigation, they save you the years of frustration of fighting with a neighbor. But in order for a boundary line agreement to be effective, it's got to be properly drafted and it has to be backed up by a land survey. And you got that land survey because you actually place the monuments where the property is being set as the boundary, so in a year or 5 years or 10 years, no one can come back and say, well, no one can come back and try to reinterpret the agreement. We'll say that. So, as I promised, I'm going to give you a story of caution. Many years ago, when I was still a high school student working with my grandfather, who's also a survey consultant, we were approached by a farmer. And the farmer in Georgia told us that his parents had passed away and he had inherited the farm. Well, that's great. But the boundary between the farm and the farm's neighbor was, we'll say, uncertain. So him and the neighbor are fighting as to where the boundary is. He thinks it's where the boundary is depicted by a row of trees, and the neighbor thinks the boundary is somewhere else. So after 2 or 3 years, they go through, they have a pre-trial motions, they're just about to have the trial, and late one night in a hearing, the 2 parties get together and they say, I'm tired of fighting, let's make an agreement, let's settle this. So the 2 attorneys draft an agreement and they say, starting at a post, a fence post, thence running southeast about 1,000 feet to a new monument that will be set by the surveyor. So we have a starting point, we've got a bearing distance, and we have a new point going to be set. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the property, if you start at the southeast corner of the properties and you run southeast, you are actually going in the wrong direction. You should have been going northwest, but instead you went southeast, and now this line that they created is not even touching any of the properties. This imaginary line running southeast actually goes into the neighbor's property. After about a week, they send me this agreement after it's been signed and drafted and everything, and they show it to me, and I explain to my client that he has actually made a boundary line agreement where the boundary as described in the document has nothing to do with the 2 properties in dispute. Wow. You want to talk about disappointment. Well, he wanted to uphold the boundary line agreement, and he wanted to just switch from southeast to northwest. But the neighbor realized that the neighbor really got the wrong end of the deal on this agreement, so the neighbor wants this whole agreement void for ambiguity and just mutual mistake. Well, the client and his neighbor spent 2 more years litigating not their boundary line, but just the boundary line agreement. So this agreement that was meant to save, tens of thousands of dollars and years of frustration actually ended up costing the client substantially more in litigation and attorney's fees than if he wouldn't have had the agreement in the first place. So why did I share this story? Well, I shared this story with you because I want you to realize that boundary line agreements are fantastic tools for settling disputes. But if you do not write the agreement properly, and if you do not monument the corners at the time of the agreement, then there's no certainty in the agreement, and it may open you up to more litigation and more cost. So what are my tips for a boundary line agreement? Make sure it's in writing, make sure the corners are monumented, and also, make sure that both parties actually agree to this before you sign it. Otherwise, the one party may try to void the agreement shortly after it's been signed because they have buyer's remorse. If you'd like to know more about a boundary line agreement, check out my website, cnettleman.net, and I've got a great little short article. And in the end, if you have the ability, I would recommend settling with a boundary line agreement as opposed to litigating, because no one wins in litigation.